My name is Bruce, I'm 62 years old, and last Christmas my son Michael broke my heart. After decades of supporting his every dream, I arrived at his lavish home for dinner, only to be humiliated. "Dad, this seat is for Richard. Move to the end of the table," he demanded, pushing me aside for his father-in-law. I stood up quietly and left maintaining my dignity. Little did they know I had secretly paid for their entire expensive dinner weeks before. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for what happens when dignity meets the perfect revenge. My story begins decades before that fateful Christmas dinner. I grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood in Cleveland, the son of a factory worker. Nothing was ever handed to me. I started working summer jobs at 14, saving every penny for college. When I met my wife Margaret during sophomore year, I knew immediately she was the one. We married young by today's standards, just 22, but back then it was normal. Margaret supported me through night school while I earned my business degree. With her encouragement, I took the biggest risk of my life at 28, starting my own construction company with just 2 employees and a second-hand truck. Those early years were lean. We lived in a tiny apartment, worked 7 days a week, and sacrificed everything for the future we were building. Our son Michael was born after we'd been married 5 years. From the moment I held him, I promised myself he would never experience the financial struggles I had faced. Margaret and I agreed on one thing above all else: our son would have every advantage we could provide. As my business slowly grew, so did our family's comfort. By the time Michael was 10, we had moved to a modest but nice home in a good school district. I was finally able to provide Margaret with some of the comforts she deserved after years of sacrifice. She never complained during the tough times, not once. Michael was a bright kid, but not particularly driven. Where I had fought for every opportunity, opportunities simply appeared for him. Maybe that was our first mistake as parents, making his path too smooth. When he wanted the latest video game console, it appeared under the Christmas tree. When he needed a computer for school, we bought the best one we could afford. We never wanted him to feel the sting of going without. I paid for his college education in full. 4 years at an expensive private university that cost more than my parents earned in a decade. I was proud to do it. When he graduated and needed a reliable car to commute to his first job, I co-signed the loan. When he found the house he wanted to buy with his new wife Amanda, I provided the down payment as a wedding gift. Amanda came from money, old money, the kind of wealth that whispers rather than shouts. Her father, Richard Preston, owned investment properties across 3 states and had connections with people whose names appeared in the business section of national newspapers. From the beginning, there was a subtle distance in how her family treated Margaret and me. At their wedding, Richard pulled me aside during the reception. "Bruce," he said, swirling expensive scotch in a crystal tumbler. "Michael tells me you built your business from the ground up. Admirable." The way he said it made it sound like I had done something quaint rather than spent 30 years building a successful company that employed 40 people. Margaret was always better at navigating these social waters than I was. She could chat with Amanda's mother about her charity functions and Mediterranean cruises without revealing that our biggest vacation splurge had been a week in Florida. After Margaret died of breast cancer 3 years ago, I lost my buffer between myself and my son's new world. The changes were subtle at first. Sunday dinners became monthly rather than weekly. Michael stopped asking for advice about home repairs, turning instead to contractors recommended by his father-in-law. When my grandchildren James and Emma were born, I noticed I was invited to fewer milestone events than the other grandparents. Still, I maintained my dignity. Margaret would have wanted that. She always said, "Bruce, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar." So I kept showing up, kept trying, kept loving my son and his family, even as I felt them slipping away. The Christmas before the incident, I had spent the holiday alone. Michael and his family had gone on a ski trip with the Prestons to Vail. "Sorry, Dad, Amanda's parents already booked everything," was the explanation I received. I spent that Christmas watching old movies and looking through photo albums of happier times. I thought perhaps my solitary holiday had registered with my son that perhaps he felt a twinge of guilt. That might explain why, after months of minimal contact, I received a call in early December inviting me to Christmas dinner at his home. I was so excited, I immediately accepted. That night, I dreamed of Margaret. In my dream, she was wearing the red sweater she always wore for the holidays, and she was smiling. I woke up feeling hopeful for the first time in months. When Michael called with the Christmas invitation, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my chest. After spending the previous holiday alone with only memories and a frozen dinner for company, the prospect of being surrounded by family again filled me with cautious optimism. "We'll do it right this year, Dad," Michael said. "The kids have been asking about you." His words were like rainfall after a drought. My grandchildren, James and Emma, were 7 and 5 now, growing so quickly. The thought of their little faces lighting up at the gifts I would bring made my heart swell. I spent weeks preparing for Christmas Day. I wanted everything to be perfect, to show Michael and Amanda that I could fit into their world. I visited 4 different toy stores to find the exact science kit James had mentioned during our brief phone conversation months earlier. For Emma, I found a handcrafted dollhouse that reminded me of one Margaret had always wanted to build for a daughter we never had. The weekend before Christmas, I pulled out our old family photo albums. There was Michael at 6 sitting on my shoulders as we decorated our first real Christmas tree. There was Margaret in her apron, flour dusting her cheeks, as she taught 10-year-old Michael how to roll out cookie dough. These memories were precious to me, tangible reminders of the family we once were. I wondered if Michael ever looked back on those simpler times with fondness, or if he had completely embraced his new life of country club memberships and summer homes. I hoped that somewhere beneath the polished exterior he now presented to the world, my boy still existed. My friend Warren came over to help me wrap the presents. We had worked together for 30 years before both retiring, and he was the closest thing to a brother I had. "You sure about this, Bruce?" Warren asked, as he struggled with a particularly stubborn piece of tape. "Last time you saw the kid, he barely gave you the time of day at that fancy fundraiser." "It's Christmas," I said simply, "and they're my family." Warren just shook his head. "Just don't get your hopes up too high. People like that, they live in a different world now." I knew what he meant by people like that. Michael and Amanda had become the kind of people who discussed vacation properties over brunch and sent their children to private schools with tuitions higher than many annual salaries. They had become the kind of people who might find my presence somewhat embarrassing at their carefully curated gatherings. Still, I refused to believe my own son would see me that way. Not after everything we had shared. The day before Christmas, I got a haircut and bought a new sweater, dark green, with a subtle pattern that the salesperson assured me was very current. I even splurged on a bottle of expensive cologne. Margaret always said I cleaned up nice and I wanted to make her proud, even if she was no longer here to see it. As I drove to Michael's neighborhood on Christmas Day, the contrast between my world and his became increasingly apparent. My modest ranch-style home in the suburbs gave way to increasingly larger properties until I reached the gated community where Michael and Amanda had built their 5-bedroom starter mansion, as Warren sarcastically called it. The guard at the entrance checked my name against a list before reluctantly waving me through. I couldn't help remembering that I had loaned Michael nearly a third of the down payment for this house, a fact that seemed to have been conveniently forgotten. The driveway was already filled with expensive vehicles, including Richard Preston's distinctive black Mercedes sedan. I parked my practical 4-year-old Ford at the end of the line, suddenly self-conscious about its ordinary appearance among such displays of wealth. With gifts balanced precariously in my arms, I approached the imposing front door. Before I could ring the bell, Amanda opened it, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Bruce," she said, her voice carrying the polite distance she always maintained with me. "Merry Christmas. Michael is in the living room with Daddy and Mother." Not your son is in the living room. The distinction was subtle but telling. In Amanda's world, I was just Bruce, an obligation rather than family. As I stepped into the foyer, I took a deep breath and reminded myself why I was here. For Michael, for my grandchildren, for the family that despite everything I still loved with my whole heart. The interior of Michael and Amanda's home looked like something from a luxury home magazine, all gleaming surfaces and professionally decorated spaces. A 12-foot Christmas tree dominated the 2-story entryway, adorned not with the handmade ornaments and sentimental decorations of my past holidays, but with coordinating glass baubles in silver and blue clearly chosen to match the home's color scheme rather than to celebrate family memories. "Dad," Michael called from the living room, rising briefly from his conversation with Richard Preston to acknowledge my arrival. "Glad you made it. Traffic okay?" The greeting was perfunctory, lacking the warmth of a son truly happy to see his father after months apart. Before I could respond properly, the grandchildren came racing down the curved staircase, momentarily lifting my spirits. "Grandpa Bruce," Emma called, her little face brightening. She at least seemed genuinely pleased to see me. James followed more slowly, offering a small wave that seemed coached rather than spontaneous. At 7, he was already absorbing the family dynamics around him, learning who was important and who was peripheral. I set down the carefully wrapped presents near the tree and knelt to embrace my grandchildren, breathing in the sweet scent of Emma's hair as she allowed me a quick hug before pulling away. "I got you both something special," I whispered. "Mom said we have to wait until after dinner to open presents," James informed me seriously. "James, Emma, come say hello to Grandpa Richard and Grandma Catherine," Amanda called from across the room, effectively ending my brief moment of connection with the children. I watched as they dutifully trotted over to the Prestons, receiving much more enthusiastic greetings and extended attention. Catherine Preston had her arm around Emma's shoulders, smoothing her hair and admiring the child's Christmas dress, while Richard was showing James something on his expensive smartphone that had the boy giggling with delight. As I stood somewhat awkwardly in the entryway, I overheard Amanda speaking quietly to the children earlier, when she thought I couldn't hear. "Remember to be nice to Grandpa Bruce, even though he's different from Grandpa Richard," she had instructed them. "He doesn't know about a lot of the things we do, but he's still your grandfather." The words stung more than I cared to admit. Different. Less than. Not quite one of them. I pushed the hurt aside and moved further into the room, trying to find a natural place to insert myself into the gathering. The pre-dinner conversations flowed around me like water around a stone. Richard was holding court, discussing a recent business acquisition that had apparently doubled in value already. Michael hung on his every word, nodding eagerly and asking questions that seemed designed to highlight his own business acumen. Bruce, Catherine Preston, acknowledged me with a nod. "Michael tells us you've been keeping busy in retirement. Gardening, was it?" "Woodworking, actually," I corrected gently. "I've been building furniture for a local shelter." How charitable, she replied, her tone suggesting I had taken up an eccentric hobby rather than continuing my lifelong skill in a way that helped others. I noticed the elaborate place settings in the dining room visible through the archway. The table was set for 12 with name cards at each setting. Curiosity drew me closer, and I scanned the table for my name. I finally found it at the far end, separated from Michael and his immediate family by several seats positioned between Amanda's cousin and someone named Tiffany, whom I had never met. The seating arrangement confirmed what I already suspected. I was an afterthought, included out of obligation rather than desire. The center of the table was clearly reserved for the Prestons and their inner circle, with Michael and Amanda positioned at Richard's right and left hands like courtiers attending royalty. As I stood contemplating this visual representation of my place in the family hierarchy, I overheard Michael and Richard discussing a business opportunity, their voices lowered, but still audible. "The investment is substantial," Richard was saying. "But with my backing and connections, your company could expand into markets you've only dreamed of." "I've been thinking about changing the company name," Michael replied. "Something more modern, more reflective of our vision going forward." My chest tightened. The company they were discussing was the construction business I had founded, the one I had built from nothing over 4 decades, the one I had turned over to Michael 3 years ago after Margaret's death. The business that still carried the Williams name, my name, our family name. In that moment, I realized how complete Michael's transformation had been. He wasn't just embracing his wife's family's lifestyle. He was systematically erasing the legacy I had built, reshaping it into something that would please his father-in-law, rather than honor his own father. With this realization heavy in my heart, I heard Amanda announce that dinner was served. The assembled guests began moving toward the dining room conversation, shifting to appreciative comments about the elaborate spread catered from Bellini's, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. What no one knew, what I had kept as a private gesture of goodwill, was that I had arranged and paid for the entire meal weeks in advance. It was to be my Christmas gift to the family, a demonstration that I could still contribute something of value to their lives. The owner of Bellini's, Tony, was an old client who had always been grateful for the work I had done renovating his restaurant 15 years earlier. He had given me a substantial discount, though the final bill had still represented a significant portion of my monthly pension. As everyone found their assigned seats, I moved toward my place at the far end of the table, steeling myself for an evening of polite distance from the family I loved. I had no idea that within minutes, even this modest place would be denied me, setting in motion events that would forever change my relationship with my son. I had just pulled out my chair at the far end of the table when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to see Michael standing there, his expression a mixture of impatience and embarrassment. "Dad," he said, his voice pitched low but still audible to those nearby. "There's been a change in the seating arrangements. This seat is for Richard's business partner who's running late." I looked down at the place card that clearly had my name on it, then back up at my son. "I thought this was my seat, Michael. It has my name." He glanced around nervously, clearly concerned about others overhearing our conversation. Amanda was watching with a slight frown from her position near the head of the table while Richard Preston observed the interaction with barely disguised annoyance. "There's been a mix-up with the cards," Michael continued, now taking my elbow and attempting to guide me away from the table. "We need you to sit at the side table we've set up in the breakfast nook. The kids will be there too," he added as though this would soften the blow. I stood rooted to the spot, a lifetime of emotions suddenly crashing over me. The side table. Like an afterthought. Like someone not worthy of a place at the main gathering. "Michael," I said quietly. If you wanted me to sit elsewhere, you could have told me before I arrived. Dad, please don't make a scene, he whispered urgently. This is important. Richard's partner can help secure the Henderson contract. You understand business decisions, right? Business decisions. As if my own son relegating me to a separate table was simply a matter of strategic networking. As if family meant nothing compared to a potential contract. Richard Preston chose that moment to approach his commanding presence, immediately dominating the interaction. Is there a problem here? He asked, his tone suggesting that any problem was undoubtedly my fault. No problem, Richard, Michael replied quickly. Dad was just going to take his seat at the kids' table. Then turning back to me with barely concealed frustration, he said the words that would echo in my mind for days to come. Dad, this seat is for my father-in-law's business partner. Move to the side table. Now. The room seemed to go silent, though in reality conversations probably continued around us. In that moment, I saw my son clearly for perhaps the first time in years. I saw the man he had become, the values he now prioritized, the people he sought to impress, at the expense of the one person who had always put him first. Amanda was now watching openly, a slight smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. Catherine Preston was engaged in conversation with another guest, deliberately ignoring the uncomfortable scene. Only my grandchildren seemed troubled, with Emma's small face scrunched in confusion, and James studiously examining his empty plate. I could have argued. I could have reminded Michael of everything I had sacrificed for him over the years. I could have created the scene he so desperately wanted to avoid. Instead, I did what Margaret would have done. I chose dignity. I understand, I said quietly, placing my napkin on the table. Enjoy your dinner. Dad. Michael said, his voice now tinged with relief that I wasn't going to embarrass him. Don't be like that. It's just a seating arrangement. But it wasn't just a seating arrangement. It was a public declaration of my place in the family hierarchy. It was my son choosing status and connections over respect for his father. It was the culmination of years of small rejections that had finally crystallized into one unmistakable message: I was no longer welcome in the world my son had created for himself. Without another word, I turned and walked away from the table, away from the gathering, away from the son who had pushed me aside literally and figuratively. I collected my coat from the front closet, hearing Michael call after me as I reached the front door. Dad, don't overreact. Come on, it's Christmas. I paused with my hand on the doorknob, turned slightly, and said simply, Merry Christmas, Michael. Then I walked out into the cold December evening, my heart heavier than the winter clouds overhead. As I drove home through streets decorated with festive lights and displays of holiday cheer, I allowed the tears to come. Not angry tears, but tears of grief for what had been lost. Tears for the little boy who once looked at me as though I hung the moon. Tears for Margaret, who would have been heartbroken to see what had become of our family. The house was dark and silent when I returned, a stark contrast to the bright, noisy gathering I had left behind. I sat in my car for several minutes, gathering the strength to go inside to an empty home on Christmas Day. As the engine ticked and cooled in the darkness, I made a decision. This would be a turning point, not just an ending. What happened next would be entirely up to me. Once inside my quiet house, I removed my coat and sat heavily in Margaret's old armchair. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me like a physical force. For nearly an hour, I simply sat there in the darkened living room, the only illumination coming from the small, artificial tree I had half-heartedly decorated weeks earlier. The silence was eventually broken by the ringing of my phone. Michael's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. He called twice more in quick succession, then sent a text. "Dad, you're overreacting. Come back. The kids are asking for you." I set the phone aside. If the children were truly asking for me, it was only because they'd been instructed to do so after my abrupt departure caused an uncomfortable situation. Michael wasn't concerned about my feelings. He was concerned about appearances. Just as I was about to turn off my phone entirely, it rang again. This time it was Warren. "Bruce, you okay? You don't usually answer so late." I hadn't realized how much time had passed. It was nearly 9 o'clock. "I left the dinner early," I said simply. "What happened?" The concern in Warren's voice was genuine, a stark contrast to the forced politeness I'd experienced at Michael's home. As I recounted the events of the evening, my initial shock and hurt began to transform into something else. Not anger exactly, but a clear-eyed understanding of my situation and my worth. "Those people," Warren muttered, his disgust evident. "After everything you've done for that boy." "It's not about what I've done for him," I replied, surprising myself with the calm in my voice. "It's about respect. Basic human respect." After talking with Warren for nearly half an hour, I felt steadier. As we were about to hang up, a thought suddenly struck me, something I had completely forgotten in the emotional turmoil of the evening. "Warren, the dinner at Michael's tonight. The catered meal from Bellini's. What about it? I paid for it. All of it. Arranged it weeks ago with Tony as my gift to the family." There was a moment of stunned silence before Warren let out a low whistle. "They don't know, do they?" "No," I confirmed. "I told Tony to keep it anonymous until the end of the night. I wanted it to be a surprise after dinner." The irony of the situation suddenly hit me. While I was being pushed aside at a dinner I had secretly paid for, Michael was undoubtedly trying to impress Richard with what he thought was his father-in-law's generosity. Tony was supposed to bring out a special dessert and make an announcement about the anonymous benefactor, then reveal it was me, I explained. "I thought it would be a nice moment, something to bring us all together." "Bruce," Warren said after a moment, "Tony doesn't know you left early." The realization dawned on me. Tony would still make the announcement as planned, revealing to everyone gathered that the lavish meal they had enjoyed was courtesy of the very person they had humiliated and driven away. I had arranged the reveal not out of a desire for recognition, but as a genuine gift of love. Now, however, it would serve a different purpose. It would be a powerful statement about value, about contribution, about the quiet dignity that my son had forgotten in his pursuit of status. "What are you going to do?" Warren asked. I considered my options carefully. I could call Tony and cancel the announcement. I could text Michael and warn him. I could find some way to soften the blow that was inevitably coming. Instead, I made a different choice. "Nothing," I said finally. "I'm going to do nothing." This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. Sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect isn't anger or retaliation, but simply allowing consequences to unfold naturally. I thanked Warren for listening and ended the call. Then I picked up my phone again and dialed Tony's number at Bellini's. When he answered, I could hear the bustling sounds of the restaurant kitchen in the background. "Bruce, Merry Christmas. The meal is going perfectly at your son's house. My best staff is handling everything." "Tony," I said calmly, "I wanted to let you know that I had to leave the dinner early due to an unexpected situation." "Oh no," Tony replied, concern evident in his voice. "Is everything okay?" "Everything is fine," I assured him. but I wanted to ask if you would proceed with the surprise announcement as planned. Of course, Tony said. The special dessert is already being prepared. We'll do the reveal exactly as you requested. Thank you, I said. And Tony, when they ask why I'm not there, just tell them I had to step out. Nothing more. After hanging up, I made a cup of tea and settled back into Margaret's chair. For the first time since leaving Michael's house, I felt a sense of peace. What would happen next was out of my hands. The truth would speak for itself more eloquently than any argument or accusation I could make. As I sat quietly in my living room, I imagined the scene that would soon unfold at the dinner table I had been deemed unworthy to join. The surprised expressions, the uncomfortable silence, Michael's realization of what he had done. It wasn't revenge I was seeking. It was simply the natural consequence of treating people as disposable, of forgetting that true worth isn't measured by social status or business connections. In that moment, I felt Margaret's presence more strongly than I had in months. I could almost hear her voice saying what she had told me so many times during our marriage. Your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, Bruce. It's in how you choose to respond. I had chosen dignity over drama. The rest would take care of itself. Back at Michael's house, I imagined the dinner proceeding without me. The conversation flowing, business connections being made, social niceties observed. Perhaps Michael had explained my absence with some plausible excuse. Perhaps I had already been forgotten in the pursuit of more important matters. What I know for certain, because Tony recounted it to me later, is what happened approximately 1 hour after my departure. The main course had been cleared, and guests were engaged in conversation over glasses of expensive wine. Richard Preston was holding court at the head of the table, regaling everyone with stories of his latest successful investment. Michael and Amanda were the perfect attentive audience, laughing at all the right moments, asking questions that allowed Richard to further display his business acumen. Then Tony himself appeared, accompanied by 2 servers, wheeling a cart with an elaborate dessert display, complete with sparklers and a bottle of Dom Perignon champagne. Conversations paused as all eyes turned to this unexpected spectacle. Tony stepped forward with the flair of a man who had been in the restaurant business for 30 years. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "on behalf of Bellini's, I would like to thank you for allowing us to serve you this Christmas evening." Murmurs of appreciation rippled around the table. "Before we serve our special holiday dessert," Tony continued, "I have been asked to make an announcement." Michael, according to Tony, looked confused. This apparently wasn't part of what he had arranged with the restaurant. Tonight's entire dining experience, from the appetizers to this champagne, has been arranged and paid for in advance by a very generous individual. Richard Preston straightened in his chair, clearly expecting to be acknowledged for what everyone assumed was his treat. Amanda smiled proudly, ready to bask in her father's generosity. "This person requested anonymity," Tony continued, "wanting only to provide a special Christmas meal for his loved ones. However, he gave me permission to reveal his identity at this time." The anticipation around the table was palpable. Richard was already beginning a modest wave of acknowledgement when Tony delivered the truth that changed everything. "Your Christmas dinner host this evening is none other than Mr. Bruce Williams, who I have had the pleasure of knowing for over 20 years." The silence that followed was absolute. Michael's face drained of color. Amanda froze with her wineglass halfway to her lips. Richard Preston's expression shifted from self-satisfaction to confusion, then to something approaching shame. "Mr. Williams arranged everything weeks ago as his gift to the family," Tony explained, unaware of the drama that had preceded his announcement. He asked that no expense be spared to make this evening special for all of you. "Where is Bruce?" Catherine Preston asked, looking around as though I might materialize from behind a curtain. "He mentioned he had to step out," Tony replied, now sensing the tension in the room. He didn't explain further. Michael stood abruptly, his napkin falling to the floor. "Excuse me," he muttered, pulling his phone from his pocket as he left the dining room. The calls began moments later. First Michael, then Amanda, then even Richard himself. I let them all go to voicemail. Whatever they had to say could wait. This evening was now for me, for my healing, for my reclaiming of self-respect. Tony told me later that the remainder of the evening was subdued, the earlier festive atmosphere replaced by a cloud of collective discomfort. The children asked repeatedly where I had gone. The elaborate dessert was eaten in relative silence. Guests began making excuses to leave earlier than planned. As Michael and Amanda were saying goodbye to the last departing guests, Tony overheard Richard Preston speaking quietly but firmly to his daughter. "You and Michael have made a grave miscalculation," he told her. "That man built something from nothing. That commands respect regardless of background." It seemed that even Richard, with all his wealth and privilege, understood something that my own son had forgotten: character and integrity matter more than social climbing and appearances. Meanwhile, I spent my evening in quiet reflection. I made myself a simple sandwich, unable to stomach anything more elaborate after the emotional turmoil of the day. I looked through old photo albums, remembering happier Christmases when Michael was young and our family was whole. I allowed myself to feel the pain of what had happened, but I refused to let it harden into bitterness. Margaret would not have wanted that. She always said that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. Instead, I focused on what I had learned, on the clarity that had emerged from this painful experience. By morning, there were 17 missed calls on my phone, and numerous text messages ranging from Michael's defensive, "It wasn't what it looked like," to Amanda's surprisingly humble, "We were wrong." Even Richard had left a message expressing his sincere admiration for my generosity. I wasn't ready to respond to any of them yet. This Christmas had become a turning point, a moment of truth that could not be undone with hasty apologies or explanations. Whatever happened next would need to be built on a foundation fought of genuine respect, not obligation or embarrassment. As dawn broke on the day after Christmas, I made a decision. I would not chase after my son's approval or inclusion in his life. I would stand firmly in my own, worth my own dignity. If reconciliation was to happen, it would need to begin with acknowledgement of the hurt caused and a sincere desire to rebuild what had been broken. I put on a pot of coffee and watched the sunrise from my kitchen window, feeling strangely lighter despite everything. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand in your truth and let that truth speak for itself. The rest, as Margaret would say, will follow in its own time. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a blur of unexpected developments. Michael continued to call daily, his messages evolving from defensive explanations to increasingly humble apologies. I maintained my distance not out of spite, but because I needed time to process everything and determine what kind of relationship I wanted moving forward. On December 28th, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, I found my granddaughter Emma and grandson James standing on the porch, bundled in winter coats and holding small packages. Behind them stood not Michael or Amanda, but Michael's sister Sarah, who had flown in from Seattle after hearing what had happened. "Uncle Bruce," Sarah said, giving me a fierce hug. "These two have been desperate to see their grandpa." I welcomed them inside, my heart lifting at the sight of the children. Emma immediately wrapped her arms around my legs. "Grandpa, we missed you at Christmas," she said. "Why did you go away?" The simple question from an innocent child nearly broke me. Before I could formulate an age-appropriate response, James spoke up. "Dad was mean to Grandpa," he said matter-of-factly. "He made him go sit at the kid table, but Grandpa went home instead." Out of the mouths of babes. I caught Sarah's eye over the children's heads, and she gave me a sad smile. She had always been more grounded than her brother, less susceptible to the allure of status and appearances. "Your dad and I had a disagreement," I told the children gently. "Sometimes adults need to take a step back when that happens." "But you paid for all the food," Emma said, her eyes wide. "The restaurant man told everyone. I wanted to give your family a nice Christmas dinner," I explained. "That doesn't change just because I wasn't there to eat it." We spent the morning together opening the presents I had originally brought to Michael's house. Sarah had rescued them before leaving with the children. Watching James and Emma play with their gifts, I felt a bittersweet happiness. These innocent souls were not responsible for their parents' behavior, and I was determined not to let the rift affect my relationship with them. After lunch, while the children were occupied with their new toys, Sarah and I talked frankly. "Michael's a mess, Bruce," she said. "I've never seen him like this." "I'm not trying to punish him," I assured her. "I just need him to understand that respect is non-negotiable." "Richard Preston called him out in front of everyone after you left," Sarah told me. "Said something about how real men don't disrespect their fathers, especially ones who built something from nothing." I found it ironic that Richard, who had previously seemed to look down on my background, was now the one defending my dignity. Perhaps there was more complexity to the man than I had given him credit for. "Amanda's been unusually quiet," Sarah continued. "I think she's genuinely ashamed. Her mother apparently gave her quite the lecture about family values." I nodded, taking this information in. "It's not about making them feel bad, Sarah. It's about establishing boundaries and expectations going forward." "I know," she replied. "For what it's worth, I think this was a long time coming. Michael needed this wake-up call." After Sarah and the children left, promising to visit again, before Sarah returned to Seattle, I felt more at peace than I had in days. The simple joy of connecting with my grandchildren had been healing, a reminder of what truly mattered beyond hurt feelings and family drama. On New Year's Eve morning, Michael finally appeared on my doorstep alone. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes and an uncharacteristic slump to his shoulders. "Dad," he said simply when I opened the door, "can we talk?" I invited him in and offered coffee, which he accepted gratefully. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had helped him with homework as a boy, where we had shared countless meals as a family. "I don't know where to begin," Michael said after a long silence. "The beginning is usually a good place," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. He took a deep breath. "I was wrong. What I did to you at Christmas was inexcusable. I've been trying to figure out how I got to a place where I could treat my own father that way, and I don't like what I'm seeing." I remained silent, allowing him to continue his self-reflection without interruption. "Somewhere along the way, I started measuring success by the wrong metrics," he went on. "The house, the car, the connections, the status. I got so caught up in impressing Richard that I forgot who really matters." "It wasn't just Christmas Day, Michael," I said quietly. "It's been happening gradually for years." He nodded, acknowledging the truth of my words. "After Mom died, I think I lost my moral compass. She always kept me grounded, reminded me where I came from. Without her, I just drifted toward whatever validated me, and that became Amanda's world, her family's approval. For the first time, I saw genuine remorse in my son's eyes, not just embarrassment at being caught behaving badly. "The company," I said, referring to the business I had built and handed over to him. "You were talking about changing the name." Michael had the grace to look ashamed. "Another mistake. Our name, our family legacy, it means something. It represents decades of hard work and integrity. I see that now. Respect isn't something you can demand, Michael. It's earned through actions, through consistency, through treating people with dignity, regardless of what they can do for you." "I know that now, Dad. And I want to earn back your respect if you'll let me try." I studied my son's face, seeing both the man he had become and the boy he had once been. The hurt he had caused was real, but so was the opportunity for growth and change that now presented itself. "This isn't going to be fixed in one conversation," I told him honestly. "Trust once broken takes time to rebuild." "I understand," he said. "I'm prepared to do whatever it takes." As we continued talking, I laid out clear expectations for moving forward. There would be regular family dinners, but at my house where everyone sat at the same table. Michael would need to demonstrate consistent respect, not just when he wanted something from me. And most importantly, he would need to model appropriate behavior for his children, teaching them by example that people's worth isn't determined by their wealth or status. Michael listened attentively, occasionally nodding in agreement. By the time he left several hours later, we had the framework of a path forward, though we both understood that the journey would not be easy or quick. That evening, as I prepared for a quiet New Year's Eve at home, I received a text message from Michael. "Dad, would you consider joining us tomorrow for New Year's dinner? Just family, very casual. The kids are asking for you." I thought carefully before responding. It would be easy to decline to maintain the distance that currently felt safe. But healing couldn't happen without engagement, without giving second chances where they were genuinely sought. "I'd like that," I replied finally. "What time should I arrive?" As I sent the message, I felt Margaret's presence stronger than ever. She would have been proud of both of us today, finding our way back to what matters most. The journey ahead would have its challenges, but I faced the new year with something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not for a perfect relationship with my son, but for an authentic one built on mutual respect and genuine love rather than obligation or appearances. And in the end, isn't that what family should be about? A year has passed since that fateful Christmas dinner, and the healing journey has been both challenging and rewarding. The path to rebuilding trust with Michael wasn't always smooth, but each step brought us closer to a more authentic relationship than we had shared in years. Initially, our interactions were cautious, each of us careful not to reopen wounds that were still tender. The first New Year's dinner at Michael and Amanda's house was notably different from previous gatherings. The elaborate decorations and formal place settings had been replaced by a simple family-style meal where everyone sat together at one table. Amanda, to her credit, approached me privately that day with her own apology. "I've been unfair to you, Bruce," she admitted. "I judged you based on superficial things that don't actually matter." Her humility surprised me, revealing a capacity for growth I hadn't previously recognized in her. Over the following months, she made consistent efforts to include me in family activities, often bringing the children for impromptu weekend visits. Richard Preston, interestingly enough, became an unexpected ally in the family's transformation. The incident had triggered a reassessment of his own values, and he began taking a genuine interest in my background and experience. "You built something real," he told me during a casual lunch several months after Christmas. "I've acquired businesses, invested in them, grown them. but I've never built one from the ground up the way you did. There's something honorable in that I've always respected, even if I didn't show it properly. The most significant changes, however, came from Michael himself. True to his word, he worked diligently to earn back my trust through consistent actions rather than mere promises. The company remained Williams Construction, with Michael even adding a tribute to my legacy on their website. He began consulting me on major business decisions, not because he needed my approval, but because he valued my experience and perspective. Most importantly, he made conscious efforts to model different values for his children. I overheard him telling James one day, "Success isn't about what you own or who you know, son. It's about integrity, hard work, and how you treat other people. Your grandfather taught me that, and I'm only now beginning to truly understand it." As for me, I learned valuable lessons as well. I recognized that I had enabled some of Michael's behavior over the years by never establishing clear boundaries or expressing my hurt when I felt sidelined. I learned to communicate my needs and expectations more directly, without sacrificing the dignity that had served me well throughout my life. I expanded my social circle beyond just family, reconnecting with old friends and making new ones through my volunteer work. Warren and I started a woodworking program at the local community center, teaching young people the satisfaction of creating something with their own hands. This Christmas, the family will gather at my house, a decision made unanimously when Michael suggested it at Thanksgiving. My modest home won't accommodate the lavish production of last year's disaster, but it will provide something far more valuable, a place where everyone is equally welcome, equally valued, and treated with the same respect. The grandchildren have been helping me decorate hanging ornaments from my and Margaret's collection, each with its own story that I share as we work. Emma is particularly fascinated by the handmade decorations Margaret and I created during our early years together, when money was tight, but creativity and love were abundant. I still miss Margaret every day, but I find comfort in knowing she would approve of how things have evolved. She always believed in the power of forgiveness and the importance of family, not as an obligation, but as a chosen commitment to stand by each other through life's challenges. The journey hasn't been perfect. There have been missteps and old habits occasionally resurfacing. But the foundation has been rebuilt on something stronger than before: mutual respect, honest communication, and a shared understanding that true family bonds are measured not by social status or material success, but by how we treat each other when it matters most. As I look toward this new Christmas celebration, I'm reminded of something Margaret often said: "It's never too late to create the family you want, Bruce." Every day is a new opportunity to choose connection over division, understanding over judgment. In the end, that fateful dinner and my quiet departure turned out to be the beginning, not the end. It was the catalyst for necessary change, for growth that might never have happened otherwise. Sometimes, standing in your dignity and truth is the greatest gift you can give, not just to yourself, but to those who need to find their way back to what truly matters. What moment in your life required you to stand up for your dignity, even if it meant walking away from someone you loved? Has a painful experience ever led to unexpected healing in your relationships? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. If this journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories about family healing and the quiet dignity that can transform even the most broken relationships. Thank you for listening, and remember that your worth is never determined by how others treat you, but by how you choose to respond with integrity and self-respect.